I now want to introduce John Macintosh. John is a lecturer in English at the University of Maryland, College Park. His current research focuses on literary representations of labor in the service sectors. His writing on labor and finance have appeared in Contemporary Literature, Finance Aesthetics, a Critical Glossary, Polygraph, Post 45, and Studies in the Novel. So John, the topic of his talk is contemporary fiction and the representational problem of labor. So John, you have the floor, and then we'll bring both of you back for a panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to echo Joel in giving a shout out to the organizers and all the people behind the scenes that put this together. It's been a really incredible couple of days, and I know how much work goes in on the back end, so thank you. As mentioned, my talk today is about contemporary fiction and the representational problem of labor. At the risk of putting the subject of this talk into doubt before it begins, I want to note that, at least upon first glance, there is very little representation of the gig economy in contemporary fiction. There are, to my knowledge, and I continue to look high and low, exceedingly few novels directly about gig work, especially if considered in the sort of popular app-mediated platform guise. That is, no DoorDash novels, no Instacart novels, no Uber novels. There's at least one novel set at an Airbnb rental and at least one about running an Airbnb rental, but nothing that represents work at other prominent gig economy workplaces like Fiverr or Upwork or any of the others. Moving beyond the representation of actual companies, there are very few novels indeed about app-mediated work at fictionalized companies either. Describing what's now known as the productivity paradox, which marks the decline of productivity growth since the 1970s, despite the rise of information systems, the economist Robert Solov once quipped that you can see the computer age everywhere but in the statistics. Now, I don't have the same type of statistical evidence with me today, but as someone who studies representation of work in contemporary fiction, I want to suggest that there's something of a precarity paradox in which you can see the gig economy everywhere but in the novel. In other words, there seems to be a lag, a concept I borrow from my co-panelist Joel Burgess, in the literary representation of newly emergent forms of work. Why is this? Is gig work not worthy of literary representation? Are stories of gig work not sellable to publishers? Or is work in the gig economy particularly difficult to represent? Historically speaking, the representation of labor has long been acknowledged as a problem for fiction, for reasons I'll discuss in a moment. So this contemporary lag is perhaps not surprising. If work is hard to represent in language generally, it's understandable that emergent forms of labor might create additional, or at least different, representational problems that writers are only beginning to address. That said, I do think that fiction writers are increasingly concerned with precarious working conditions, not least because the majority of them also experience those conditions. And as a result, this concern with changing forms of work is beginning to emerge, slowly but surely, in contemporary fiction. I mean this both explicitly in cases where some form of emergent work is taken up as subject or central theme, and implicitly in the ways that economic imperatives in the publishing industry and the economy more generally shape the production, distribution, and consumption of fiction, as my colleagues Sarah Briette, Dan Sinekin, and Lee Constantinu, among others, have studied. In any case, I would suggest that all novels are about work, even, perhaps especially, the ones that aren't. I want to argue today that the changes in how many of us work, wrought by the shift of the services generally, and the tendency towards gig or contract work specifically, do register in fiction, but often in oblique ways. In this talk, I'll first give a brief literary historical overview of work as a representational problem before turning to Hallie Butler's 2019 novel, The New Me, to show how one author represents contemporary temporary work. I will suggest that to capture temp agency work, Butler develops a representational strategy that relies heavily, and I think notably, on the conditional mood. In this section, I will argue that the novel's protagonist Millie could, in this section, I will argue that the novel's representation of work is largely about what the novel's protagonist Millie could or should be doing outside of working hours, or even during working hours, to secure better non-temporary employment, but also what she believes non-temporary employment would enable her to do or to become. Next, I will address Millie's simultaneous dissatisfaction with temp agency work alongside her fear of committing to an unfulfilling long-term job. After all, issues with working conditions extend beyond the length of contract. Finally, I will conclude by arguing that Butler's emphasis on conditionality, or being conditional, is characteristic of work in the gig economy, in which workers are coerced by narratives of personal responsibility into self-improvement, while the conditions of capital ultimately rest outside their individual control. Work is a representational problem. At the risk of oversimplification, representation refers to how reality is depicted in a specific medium. In the case of fiction, authors represent reality through their linguistic and narrative choices and strategies. A representational problem in literature is some phenomenon or thing, for one reason or another, that is difficult to represent faithfully in language. Work is one such representational problem. In her 1994 study, Resisting Representation, Elaine Scarry argues that the phenomena that are problematically abstract or problematically concrete are difficult to represent in language. With regards to the former, Scarry discusses their representation of abstractions like truth or cognition, both of which seem too immaterial or diffuse to discuss in language. For the latter, she focuses on the representation of physical pain and the representation of work, both of which are phenomena that, quote, take place outside of language that need to be brought in. Her concern with each of these problems, the two abstract and the two concrete, is ultimately about the question of the knowability of the world through fictional representation. For instance, she asks, how can a writer, quote, represent the deep interior of another person at labor? How can we as readers know the reality of work through language? How does one faithfully represent what work is and what it means to be the person doing it? Since the rise of the novel, work seems to be at once everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Scarry notes that, quote, work is a subject extensively represented in 18th and 19th century British novels, and a subject that is, in fact, a natural affinity with it. Nonetheless, labor is a subject that in some ways, fundamental ways, is difficult to represent. The main subject of Scarry's study of work in the 19th century is the novels of Thomas Hardy, whose, quote, problem is how to represent the unceasing activity of physical labor when linguistic structure that accommodates action, sentence verbs, and story plots, more easily accommodate discrete actions that start and stop. In other words, in its essence, work, specifically in this case manual labor, tends to be continuous, habitual, repetitive, whereas fiction's representational strengths tend to lie in representing unique and progressive action. Repetition is anathema to plot, which feeds on difference, change, and growth. Work is boring. Love and life, and especially the loss of love or life, are interesting. Besides, readers don't necessarily want to read about toil when they're at rest from it, although in Madeline's talk earlier, clearly people are watching TV while they're doing it. And yet I want to suggest that work can be represented. Scarry argues that Hardy solves the representational problem of repetitive physical labor by, quote, making the structure of all narrative action entail, and often depend on, the physical continuity of man and his materials. Work is represented in the way that a worker changes their materials or their environment, or the way that work leaves physical traces on the worker. A commodity is produced, a row is hoed. Over time, as the result of work, a back is bent or fingers are gnarled. In either case, the result of having worked leaves behind a material trace on the world or on the body that can be represented in language. We see less representation of work as a process than the resulting products of work, whether the commodity or the body that is changed. Scarry identifies two additional 19th century strategies that authors use to represent work, both of which I would argue are still in use by fiction writers today, despite changes in the composition of work and of the workforce. The first strategy is to divide continuous representation of work into task units, peppering different moments of the labor process throughout a text to try and ultimately arrive at something representing the whole. Descriptions of a singular part of the labor process then are intercut with enough dialogue or characterization or plot progression to keep the narrative moving, to keep it interesting. The second strategy was to focus on the moment when the usual work process enters into some kind of crisis, where work breaks down and needs to be reinitiated or restored, a rupture in the continuous routine that turns the monotony of work into a singular event capable of being represented as discrete action. For instance, a wheel on a cart breaks and needs to be repaired to continue the journey to market, thus drawing attention to the labor that undergirds it. Or a strike is called, stopping work in order to make its absence visible. The whole of Scary's argument is far too nuanced and elaborate for me to gloss here in just a few minutes, but the takeaway that I'm getting at is that in the face of representing work, novelists are forced to develop strategies to make it visible, to capture it in language, to bring it in, and to do it in a narratively satisfying way. It goes without saying that the work that most people do has changed a great deal since the 19th century novels that Scary takes as her objects. If, following her argument, Thomas Hardy was able to represent work by showing how the worker changed their physical environment or the traces that the environment left on them, how does one represent work that does not produce a material good? How does one represent service, as varied and potentially non-tangible as that might seem? And what's more, how does one represent forms of gig work that, depending on the gig, might be characterized less by continuity and repetition than by constant change and adaptation? How ultimately can novelists register labor in the contemporary gig economy? In my own work on contemporary fiction, I suggest that an additional representational problem comes about with the shift from an economy primarily dominated by production to one increasingly based in service work, that baggy category that manages to encompass industries as varied as fast food service and financial services. This additional representational problem stems from a shift in the primacy of the economy, if not the social imaginary, of productive industries to those in circulatory and socially reproductive industries. My current book project examines how novelists since 1980 have, slowly, developed strategies to represent work in the service sectors, including but not limited to the gig economy. The chapters of this work in progress grapple with how novelists respond to changes resulting from globalization, the tendency towards so-called immaterial and feminized labor, and the threat of technological automation. Over the course of the manuscript, I argue that domestic work novels of the 1980s and early 1990s respond formally to a push-pull dynamic of labor migration in which domestic worker narrators optimistically ascribe themselves too much narrative agency in a fully globalized economy, and those narrated by employers far too little. More recent novels set in the restaurant industry use formal repetition and episodic plot structures to evoke the painful routines of interactive service work. Novels that register the rise of Silicon Valley and its influences on the gig economy reveal less the specter of automation than the increased use of managerial surveillance and the production of ever more degraded forms of sweated work. In an excerpt from another chapter on temp agency work, I now want to turn to Hallie Butler's The New Me and its representation of conditional life through the conditional mood. Being conditional. This chapter, or the chapter this excerpt is drawn from, examines the relationship between gendered labor and the erosion of the long-term employment contract. Protagonists in these novels, on one hand, recognize structurally their status as temporary workers to be the result of a shift in labor market towards temporary contract, just-in-time labor, but on the other hand, experience their temporary status individually as a result of a personal failing that might be overcome through self-improvement or hard work. These contemporary temporary work novels, if we can call them that, varied as they are in style and tone, represent various forms of service work less through their direct representation than through fantasies of self-improvement and work on the self. Their protagonists hold out hope that if one becomes a good enough person, one might become a good enough temp. And if one can become a good enough temp, one might be able to transition into a coveted long-term position in the style of the post-war arrangement of labor. In the chapter, the novels that I discuss under the umbrella of temp work, again, as varied as they are, include Helen DeWitt's 2011 Lightning Rods, Heike Geisler's 2014 Seasonal Associate, and Hilary Leicester's 2020 Temporary, among others. But today I'm going to focus on Hallie Butler's The New Me, an acerbically funny and purposefully cringe-inducing workplace novel that sends up millennial cruel optimism. The novel's first-person narrator, Millie, is a 30-year-old college graduate from a well-to-do family who's underemployed at a temp agency and is, for much of the novel, placed as a receptionist at a furniture showroom making $12 an hour. The New Me is arguably a workplace novel, with approximately half of the novel's pages set inside of the showroom, yet not much actual work is represented. Millie is often bored, not tasked with enough to do, either because her immediate supervisor and coworkers don't trust her, or because they think she's incompetent, or because structurally she's a temp and thus to be distrusted, or some combination thereof. The novel's depiction of work, strictly speaking, involves just a few phone calls that Millie answers, usually getting yelled at by customers who are aggrieved and comically in the wrong, as anybody that has worked this kind of job knows. Millie also completes a bundle of packets, and in an example of task units that Scary identified, slowly shreds a stack of paper over a handful of scenes, sort of intercut. But mostly in these workplace scenes, Millie doesn't work much at all. Instead, she complains about her lot, chats with her coworkers, whom she loathes and whom loathe her, Googles self-improvement advice, and drinks burnt coffee from the break room. Yet despite any lack of sustained representation of actual work or the working process itself, I argue that labor in the gig economy is present, but displaced, represented instead through her fantasies of and fitful attempts at self-improvement, which she understands to be crucial to advancing to a permanent position. Butler represents temp work obliquely then. Much of the work represented in the novel is actually fantasy work or work on the self. The desire for self-improvement that might guarantee better work and thus a better life is represented through conspicuous use of the conditional mood, could, should, would, which figures what a worker might accomplish if certain conditions are met. This representational strategy accounts not for what is or what is done, but what could be and what that could allow. Instead of representing what Millie does at work, as we might expect in a novel about labor, Butler represents what Millie thinks she should do to beat the stacked odds of working in the gig economy and what she could or would do with her life if she had a more stable and better paid job. And then the novel list takes the form of lists with conditional verbs. They comprise a significant amount of the novel's narration, both in scenes at work and away from work. For instance, while bored at the furniture showroom, Millie fantasizes about how making better decisions, sometimes contradictory ones, in life will improve her career. She thinks, quote, I should read a book. I should make some friends. I should write some emails. I should go to the movies. I should get some exercise. I should unclench my muscles. I should get a hobby. I should buy a plant. I should call my exes, all of them, and ask them for advice. I should figure out why no one wants to be around me. I should start going to the same bar every night, become a regular. I should volunteer again. I should get a cat or a plant or some nice lotion or some white strips, start using a laundry service, start taking myself both more and less seriously, end quote. And in this mock epic list, the implication is that improvements to life are indistinguishable from the potential of improving career prospects and thus improvements to life. So it's sort of tautological, a virtuous cycle. Developing better habits, seeking relationships, asking advice, volunteering, taking on responsibilities. All are decisions, life hacks that Millie thinks she can use to improve her life in ways that will not only make her happier, but also more employable. In this fantasy, there are things that one should do that will secure non-temporary employment and overall satisfaction. This type of conditional mood listing dominates the narration of the novel, whether it's Millie regretfully noting the choices that she should make to advance her career, or choices that she could make to better her lot. For instance, in another representative passage, she reasons, quote, if I hadn't gone out last night, I could have woken up this morning and gone to the museum, the movies, the store, looked at job postings, found a yoga class, called my mother, adopted a cat, looked at my old yearbooks, put on a record, cleaned my apartment. While many of these desires seem to be more about life in general than work specifically, in Millie's mind, they're a sort of tautological key. Living correctly means a greater likelihood of finding a job that will allow her to live correctly. Furthermore, beyond what Millie should or could do to better her chances at finding a more stable job, there's a sense that achieving more stable work will solve all of her other problems. For instance, she thinks, quote, I could have more friends if I had more money. I could be easier to get along with if I had more stability. If I had a real job, it might come with more responsibilities. I guess I've been wanting those, end quote. A raise, security, a real job with responsibilities that would allow Millie to improve her life in ways outside of work. If she does what she should do to secure a stable career, she could achieve a life outside of it that she desires. So good work is thus conditioned by living correctly. In this way, the good life conditions good work, and good work conditions living right. For Millie, becoming a better person would allow her to get a better job, and getting a better job would allow her to actualize herself. To give another longer list quote, the last one, I promise. If I were a better person, I wouldn't have to be so judgmental all the time. I couldn't be free of it. Gym membership, Instacart, there's our one reference. Take Sarah out to dinner to celebrate, join a book club, little steps, money to go out to the movies. I could go to Saturday matinees when everyone else is hungover. I could be one of those people who doesn't drink, but just engages. Volunteer at the women's shelter again. Apologize to them. They're not mad. Take a trip home to see your mother and pay for it. Take her to lunch. Focus on the benefits of a real job. In Millie's worldview, the transition to a steady job would remove all of the conditionality of her temporary existence. She suggests that with a regular schedule, better pay, less precarity, more respect, her life could be fixed. And that's not nothing. In fact, it's understandable. However, despite her persistent fantasies of self-improvement to be able to gain access to better, less precarious work, Millie is fundamentally ambivalent about what that might actually entail. Temp to perm. Millie both desires and fears the standard contract of the post-World War II arrangement of labor, long-term work, a set schedule, benefits, and so on. Despite her middle-class background and college degree, Millie understands herself to be particularly unemployable, stunted, unable to manage her life, her career, her affairs. She vacillates between the belief that she can elevate herself into permanent employment through self-improvement and hard work, on one hand, and the realization that contemporary realities of the labor market are structural impediments to doing so, on the other. The latter impulse, which I don't have time to discuss here, manifests in her increasingly violent fantasies of revenge over the course of the novel, as well as her obsession with watching true crime television. And that's the subject of a larger argument. As a result, her character waffles between an internalized imperative of personal responsibility and self-actualization through hard work and a cannier understanding that it's the labor market that is degraded and stunted, not herself. This form of conflicted subjectivity about work is evident from the novel's first few pages. Describing her employment at the furniture showroom, Millie notes, quote, "I'm the new temp, 10 days into my assignment here. I'm getting better temp assignments lately, and my rep writes to tell me things like, I'm so excited for you. This one has the possibility of temp to perm, but so far perm hasn't come. I wonder how I would have to behave, how many changes I would have to make to tip myself over the edge into this endless abyss of perm." Millie is encouraged by her agency representative that a permanent position is imminent if she continues to perform her temp assignments well. Rather than interrogating the conditions under which the unlikelihood of a permanent position is exacerbated precisely by the downward pull of flexibilized temp work labor on worker security generally, in other words, temp work makes all work more insecure, Millie instead finds faults in her individual behavior and ponders ways that she can correct them in order to secure the position. The inability to attain secure work is figured as a problem of personal decision-making rather than structural labor market management strategies. However, despite the possibility of more secure work, Millie dreads equally the work she'll have to do on herself to make herself more permanently employable, as well as the possibility of actually achieving that. Obviously, permanent work is preferable to temping in the sense of job status and security, but if a job is undesirable despite its temporal status, then permanent work merely ensures the duration of what Millie understands to be shit work. Finally, the traditional arrangement of labor, or figuring the traditional arrangement of labor as an endless abyss, suggests that the problems of contemporary work extend beyond temporary status. Millie even tells herself that on some level, some aspects of temping are preferable, but ultimately understands that even these minor benefits are illusory. She notes, quote, "I think I'm drawn to temp work for the slight atmospheric changes. The new offices and coworkers provide a nice illusion of variety. Like how people switch out their cat's wet food from chicken and liver to sea bass, but in the end, it's all flavored anus." Sorry. Millie begins by suggesting that temping is a personal choice that keeps work life more interesting through variety. However, she undercuts this notion immediately, noting that a change in scenery doesn't actually make temping more appealing. If temping holds out the promise that an intolerable situation might change in its particulars, the underlying negatives of undesirable work remain. On one hand, temp work offers variety, even if that variety means being forced to constantly scramble. On the other, permanent work promises more security, but also the inevitability of unchanging tedium. Millie's ambivalent goal of permanent employment is linked with her fantasies of self-improvement and self-actualization, and her fear of committing to an unfulfilling job. When her rep asks her if she can imagine doing her current job long-term, implying without evidence and ultimately incorrectly that the job might transition into a permanent one, Millie's, quote, ears start ringing very low, very slightly, and she plays out scenarios ranging from a pay raise and a savings account to a fully realized depression that lasts for years and finally erases me. I look around. Are they happy? I think about the pay raise again, and my stomach lurches. As she plays out the potential effects on her life, she has a physical reaction. She needs the money and wants the stability, but is depressed at the reality of spending life in a job that she already hates. She's caught in a double bind between the need to reproduce herself and the need to work an alienated job to do so. Millie links a permanent job to her identity and sense of self, but if that desire is fulfilled, she might find herself unfulfilled. If Millie is a temp, there's a possibility of moving up, a sense in which she has some potential yet to eventually find meaningful work. However, as soon as she transitions to regular employee doing the work that she already finds meaningless, this potential for a better life would ultimately vanish, relative security or not. In one scene, faced with the possibility, which doesn't ultimately materialize as suggested, of being offered non-temporary job at the furniture showroom, Millie retreats to the bathroom to try and regain her composure. Quote, I stand at the bathroom sink, gripping the edges. My ankles give out and I rub water on my face and wonder why I'm making such a big deal out of this. This is what the plan was. This is what I thought would happen. And this is what I wanted to happen. While a permanent position is what she thinks she wants, the reality of the long-term commitment sinks in. She notes she will soon be, quote, in here, in this building, in this routine, merging, submitting, moving forward while staying in the same place, moving forward by staying in the same place, end quote. While temping means insecurity and flux, it also keeps open the fantasy that a change for the better is possible, even if that change will never quite fulfill the better life she's seeking. And constant movement appears to bring the potential for new opportunities, that maybe the next job will be the one that breaks the cycle. With permanence, any movement forward is confined. There is potential for real progress, promotion, but it feels more like stasis. Talking on the phone with her mother, Millie describes her predicament. Quote, it's just, I really hate the idea of this job. Everyone there is so ridiculous, and the work is completely meaningless. And thinking about taking the job is depressing. I mean, thinking about where it might lead is completely depressing, end quote. Comments like these betray Millie's sense of what sort of work she is meant to do. While the tone of the novel suggests that Millie has an inflated sense of self, and is perhaps somewhat entitled, that doesn't mean that she isn't ultimately correct in her doubts about what the job security would entail if other aspects of the job remain the same. In the end, Millie does not get the promotion that her agency rep has implied, or led her on to, perhaps. Instead, she is unceremoniously fired before the contract is even up and is replaced with an intern, right? So another step down the scale. Her subsequent calls to the temp agency rep to find herself a new placement are ignored. She gets ghosted, basically. She's left without any work at all. So to conclude, despite Millie's understanding of what she could change about herself to get a permanent job, or what she could achieve in her life when she does, the new me ultimately suggests that the fantasy of self-improvement suggests that the fantasy of self-improvement as a vehicle for job advancement is just that, conditional, subject to conditions outside of her control, not guaranteed. That is, it is not ultimately Millie's individual choices that govern her potential employability, but rather a two-tiered labor market that serves to degrade work for all, temporary and permanent alike. The conditional mood that Butler employs then is not, I want to stress, merely a stylistic choice at the level of form. Instead, it speaks to the content of the temporary work and helps to represent the realities of work in a gig economy. Conditionality, in this sense, is not about possibility, as Millie sometimes is able to will herself to believe, as if making the right choices in life would amount to satisfying long-term career choices. Instead, conditionality is ultimately about conditions that a single worker cannot control despite their efforts. The novel's use of the conditional mood is thus a representational strategy that marks out conditional labor, or better yet, labor purposely made conditional, precarious, in which working conditions are determined not by how much one works on their self or works hard on the job, but by the purposeful decisions of employers. In other words, labor conditions are a series of standards that are not fixed but mutable, up to the whims of economic imperatives, in which workers can try as hard as they like to make themselves better, more efficient, more employable, more visible to capital, but in which capital's demands ultimately dictate the conditions under which they work. The novel ends, perhaps cynically, perhaps inevitably, with a flash forward, with Millie complacent and resigned, finally employed in a permanent job, seen from the perspective of a younger temp worker who is judging her pretty hard. Given her doubts about unfulfilling work, it's unclear whether she's achieved what she desired or has given up. The novel suggests that these are fundamentally the same thing. Self-improvement for career advancement leaves the structures of employment in place. An individual changing her behavior and moving up from temp to perm, from conditional to stable employment, is not a solution to the degraded working conditions in the gig economy. Instead, we need to look outside the novel, outside the text, and collectively change the conditions of that work. Thank you.